Hello, I'm Dr. Bridget Nash, and I'd like to welcome you to The Therapy Show, a podcast series that seeks to demystify mental health treatment. Today, I'm honored to welcome Deb Dana, who is a licensed clinical social worker and a leading expert in the field of using polyvagal theory in therapy. Deb Dana is a consultant for the Traumatic Stress Research Consortium in the Kinsey Institute, which is focused on using the lens of polyvagal theory to understand and resolve the impact of trauma. She is the author of the book, The Polyvagal Theory in Therapy, Clinical Applications of the Polyvagal Theory. And I encourage everyone to read her new book, Polyvagal Exercises for Safety and Connection, which will be released in April 2020. Deb, welcome to The Therapy Show.
It is lovely to be here with you, Bridget. Thanks for having me.
So can you start by telling us a little bit about your personal background and professional development that led you to your research in using polyvagal theory in therapy?
Sure. As you said, I'm a licensed clinical social worker, and I've always been sort of a neuroscience nerd. I've always thought that therapists should understand the brains and bodies of our clients, since that's really what we're impacting when we're doing therapy. So when I read Steve Porges' book, Polyvagal Theory in Therapy, it was as if a missing piece of a puzzle had come into place for me, something I hadn't known I was missing until it came. And then there was that aha moment that said, oh, this is what I need to bring into my work with clients. And so from there, I was working with a group practice, and one of our goals was to bring speakers to Maine. I live in Maine, to create a neuroscience-informed clinical community. So we invited Steve and his wife, Sue Carter, to come and do a workshop for us. And I met Steve and learned more about understanding polyvagal theory, and was already starting to play around with how do I help clinicians bring this into practice, because we all agreed it is fascinating and important information. And then what do we do? So my passion took me to the what do we do with this to bring it into therapy. And it's sort of been a very fascinating adventure since that day.
So how would you briefly explain how clinical therapists use polyvagal theory in therapy to someone who is a non-professional?
So polyvagal theory really tells all of us how our nervous system, how our biology is organized, and how it really is this fundamental system of our biology that is moving us through the world, helping us navigate the world in whatever ways are needed in the moment. And so to help therapists or even non-therapists understand this is really to begin to look through the lens of the nervous system rather than through the cognitive stories that we tend to explain how we are engaging in the world, explain our relationships, our behaviors, our thoughts, our feelings. When we begin to look through the lens of the biology of the nervous system, we can look at the autonomic state that is the beginning point for all of those other things that are important to us, but flow from our biological response in the world. So it really is a very fascinating way to go beneath the feeling, beneath the behavior, go underneath the story to hear the story of your nervous system rather than the story that your brain has created.
So when and how did you realize that using a polyvagal theory framework would be an effective form of therapeutic intervention?
You know, I played around with how do you first understand what this is, what polyvagal theory is, and then how do you bring that to clients? And along the way to doing that, it became abundantly clear to me that polyvagal theory first is a theory for the therapist, for the clinician, because we have to be able to regulate our own nervous systems in order to offer that regulating energy to our clients. And this was a very, simple, not easy is the way I call it, way to really understand what am I doing with my nervous system that is then engaging my client's nervous system. The beginning point, I was offering workshops to therapists for what to do with your clients, and then took that step back and said, wait a minute, all of this first has to apply to us. And then once you understand it, as I like to say, from the inside out, then we can begin to think, so how do I then help my client understand their system from the inside out? And I like to say that when you work in a polyvagal informed way, you are becoming yourself and helping your clients become active operators of our nervous systems.
That makes a lot of sense, especially for me as a therapist.
Mm-hmm.
Who would benefit from integrating a polyvagal theory approach in psychotherapy?
That's a great question. I actually think anyone, anywhere benefits from understanding a polyvagal informed approach to living, to life, and especially to therapy, because we all have a nervous system. It is the common denominator in human experience. We have a nervous system that is the foundation for our lived experience. And so in its most basic way, all therapy is working with the nervous system. So to not understand this basic system, leave something out of the therapy process. If you understand the way the nervous system is organized and how to engage it in a way that is safe for the client and help the client then begin to work with their own nervous system, it makes any other model of therapy more effective. So it's as if polyvagal can be embedded in any of these other models. And when you start there and make this an explicit awareness, everything becomes a bit more powerful, I think.
So what is the autonomic nervous system?
So the autonomic nervous system is your parasympathetic and sympathetic systems combined to make what's called the autonomic nervous system. The lovely thing about polyvagal theory that Steve really discovered and developed in this theory that makes this different from the old way of understanding the autonomic nervous system is that parasympathetic, which used to be just called our rest and digest system, and sympathetic, fight and flight. What we now understand is that the parasympathetic, two distinct branches. It has the ventral vagal branch, which helps us feel safe, social, connect. And when I say connect, it is not simply connect to others, but connect to ourselves, to others, to the world, and to spirit. And then the dorsal vagal system, which is the oldest part of the nervous system and the oldest part of parasympathetic, which takes us into that state of collapse or numb or shutdown that's so common, both in everyday living and especially with our trauma survivor clients. And then we have the sympathetic system, which we used to call fight and flight. I think we now would like to call the mobilizing system because it does more than fight or flight. So the nervous system has these three branches, these three circuits, two branches, parasympathetic, sympathetic, but three branches within that. And they work in an ordered hierarchy. They work from oldest to newest. So the oldest system in the nervous system was this dorsal vagal system that long, long ago, if we think of the evolutionary history of the phylogenetic history of our evolution, 500 million years ago, the dorsal vagal system was what was there. And in order to survive, there was an immobilization, a disappearing. And because evolution is very smart, we didn't throw that out when the next system came online. Sympathetic came online about 400 million years ago. So not only could we immobilize and disappear, but now we could run or fight. And then the most recent system, 200 million years ago, this ventral vagal system, then allows us to use social communication and connection in order to manage negotiating relationships and negotiating the world. So you see, we have these three distinct patterns that are created over our evolutionary history and all still work in this mammalian system that we have now in present time. And we see flavors of this all the time. We see moments of disappearing, moments of mobilizing, and hopefully many moments of feeling safe and socially connected.
So how does trauma affect an individual's nervous system?
So the nervous system is a system that is shaped by our experience, by our experiences with others, by our experiences as we move through the world with the environment. So a traumatic environment, traumatic events begin to shape the nervous system towards protection rather than connection. We're hopefully built more towards moving into connection. And if we come into the world and are met with another regulated nervous system in a family that's fairly regulated in an environment that's safe enough, our nervous system begins to look towards connection. In the absence of those things, and when there are cues of danger rather than cues of safety, our system begins to shape towards protection out of survival, which makes perfect sense. So our trauma survivor clients and those of us who are still carrying unresolved trauma in our system, the nervous system is going to be really looking carefully at, is this safe in this moment or not? Which is that other organizing principle of polyvagal theory called neuroception. And neuroception is the way our bodies, through our autonomic nervous system, detect cues of safety or danger without benefit of our thinking brain. And so all of this is going on below the level of conscious awareness. And neuroception is reaching inside your body. So it's listening inside and then listening outside in the environment and listening to what's happening between you and other nervous systems. So these three streams of awareness are helping the nervous system be shaped towards connection or protection. So the trauma has an important impact on the nervous system. And the hopefulness about polyvagal theory is that the nervous system continues to be shaped by our lived experience every moment. So the way that a system has been shaped towards protection can be reshaped towards connection.
Can you briefly describe the theory of hierarchy of response?
So the autonomic nervous system was created in a hierarchical order, and we move through that pattern in predictable ways. As we talked about before, dorsal vagal collapse, numbing, some flavor of disappearing, becoming invisible is the oldest survival response to the bottom of the hierarchy. I use a ladder image to think about the hierarchy. So the very bottom of the ladder is this dorsal vagal place. And then as we climb up the ladder halfway, we come to sympathetic, the next system to come online, which gives us mobilizing energy. And in a survival response, it's fight and flight. And then if we climb to the top of the ladder, here's where we find the ventral vagal system, that system of safety and social connection and engagement. And what we see, and if we put it on the ladder, we can really get that flavor, is that I do believe that our autonomic nervous system has an inherent capacity and longing to be at the top of the ladder in ventral. Here's where we feel healthy, both psychologically and physically healthy at the top of the ladder in ventral. And then as we get challenged by daily experience, we move down the ladder a few rungs and we end up somewhere in sympathetic and hopefully can climb back up to ventral. That ventral sympathetic experience happens all the time in small ways. We don't fully go into fight or flight, but we feel the mobilizing energy of sympathetic and then come back to a little more ease. If we get to sympathetic and the challenge is too much, it overwhelms us, we then fall to the bottom of the ladder in dorsal. And the nice thing about seeing the image of the ladder is that from dorsal, you can see you have to climb up through some mobilizing sympathetic energy to reach ventral again. And it's not that we need to go through fight and flight. We simply have to feel some mobilizing energy in our system, because in dorsal at the bottom of the ladder, we are in conservation mode. Our systems have gone into this shutdown place where there's not enough energy to run our systems. And so you can see that bringing a bit of energy in is important. And it's the sympathetic system that brings in a bit of that energy. And then we make our way back up to the top of the ladder in ventral to safety again. And we do this predictably. Some of us spend more time in sympathetic and others of us take what I call the express elevator through sympathetic to dorsal. But we all travel this hierarchy in some way, and that makes it useful to understand because we can map it. And having a map is an incredibly helpful thing for we humans. When we have a map, we know where we are. We begin to know how to return to what I call our home in ventral. And then we begin to understand, well, what takes us to these other places? And I would like to say that the goal of a life of well-being is not to be in ventral all the time. It's not leaving ventral that brings us suffering and both physical and mental illness. It's leaving ventral and getting stuck in sympathetic or dorsal that does that. So the fact is we all leave ventral many times a day and feel flavors of sympathetic mobilization and dorsal immobilization, but we have a flexibility of response. We can then come back, find our way back to ventral. We don't get stuck in the survival response. And it's only that experience of being stuck, unable to find our way back to ventral, that brings physical and mental dis-ease and illness.
How do all these systems work together?
So the three systems really are in a relationship with each other, as we are, our brains and bodies, and, the way we're organized is all a relationship between systems. The autonomic nervous system being no different from any of the others. It's when we have enough ventral vagal in our system. So it's, I like to think of ventral holding sympathetic and dorsal in an embrace, giving them a hug, that we're in this organized, safe enough place to move through the world and make sense of our lives through that lens of, the world's safe enough and I know how to move through it. And so when ventral is in that position, the sympathetic nervous system does its non-reactive role, its very important role in our system of managing breath rhythms and heart rhythms and giving us mobilizing energy for our limbs and bringing us that energy we need to engage in passionate, joyful, exciting, playful ways with the world. And dorsal in the background does its very important role of running our digestion in a healthy way. So you can see that as ventral is sort of overseeing the system, sympathetic and dorsal join in, and we have this system that's in healthy homeostasis. When ventral is challenged and can't meet the demand of whatever it is that's happening in the world, then we leave ventral. And when ventral turns off, we then move into sympathetic in that survival response of fight and flight, which also brings that HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis on board, flooding us with cortisol and adrenaline, which we know is not a healthy state on an ongoing basis for our bodies. And then sympathetic, when it can no longer do its job, goes offline. And then we are fully in a dorsal collapse, numb, disappearing mode. So you can see that as these three states work together under the guidance of ventral, sympathetic and dorsal bring their very important roles. It's only when ventral loses its grip, when it can't hold on because the challenge is too great, that then we move into these survival responses. And I do want to put the word adaptive in front of survival response, because any time the nervous system enacts a sympathetic or a dorsal survival response, it's done that because there's a neuroception of more cues of danger than safety. And it's simply acting in order to ensure your survival. And the nervous system doesn't make moral meaning or assign motivation to this. It only acts to ensure survival. We humans are the ones who make moral meaning out of somebody's behavior. And so one of the things that I really appreciate about looking through the lens of polyvagal theory is we can look at another person and look at them through the lens of the nervous system and be curious about what are the cues of danger that are present right now for that system that it has gone into this survival response. A very different way of looking at another person rather than thinking about the cognitive story that our brain makes up about how they are doing something bad or they're bad or they're not trying hard enough or they're not willing to connect, and simply looking at, their biology has taken them to this other place where they are unable to come into safe connection.
And I wonder, is this where the mental and the physical intersect? Because I'm thinking this could be where physical illness occurs as well as mental distress.
Yes, absolutely. A dysregulated nervous system brings a whole host of both mental distress, but also physical illness. And there's a lot of research going on about how a dysregulated nervous system then brings some of these chronic conditions and also the conditions that come and go. So again, both for physical and psychological well-being, it's this regulated nervous system, this ability to flexibly return to ventral that is the essential element, which doesn't mean that physical illness apart from the nervous system doesn't exist. But when I'm working with clients and they have physical conditions, when we can regulate the nervous system, it's always interesting to see how much of those physical symptoms then reduce or resolve and, what really is left then. So absolutely, the nervous system is this place, this system in our body that impacts both our psychological well-being and our physical well-being.
So what happens when people form habitual patterns of action, disconnection, and engagement?
We do form habitual response patterns because, I like to think that our autonomic nervous system takes in the information and then begins to be shaped in these ways. And, if we think about our own systems, I've recently been talking to people about I like to think a home and ventral, that really is for all of us, our home, meant to be our home. And when I'm working with people, I say, we're just reminding your nervous system that it knows the way home to ventral. It knows how to navigate this hierarchy back to ventral. So that's our home. And then we each, I like to say, have a home away from home, that we are more shaped towards sympathetic or dorsal. We do all of them, certainly. We do both sympathetic and dorsal, but we have sort of a tendency because of our shaping, our patterning in our life experience of going more towards one than the other. So for my system, I am shaped much more toward a dorsal survival response than a sympathetic mobilizing response. So when I leave ventral, I go very quickly through sympathetic and end up in this dorsal flavor of disappearing, becoming invisible. Other people are going to go to sympathetic and be much more in that mobilizing, big energy place as a survival response. And that's their home away from home. So, these habitual response patterns are fascinating to sort of map. Again, we come back to mapping. I think mapping is so important because as we begin to understand our own shaping and our own habitual response patterns and be able to begin to track them throughout the day, then we begin to see, it makes sense that here's what happens to me. And it makes sense that here's what happens to my partner. And then we can begin to have a different conversation. And I can begin to take some responsibility for reshaping my system because I've now discovered how it's been shaped. If it's all a mystery, if I don't understand why my nervous system takes me to these places and how I get there, then it's really difficult to repattern it. So understanding and mapping the responses is the first step towards them beginning to reshape, which then creates a new story about who I am and how I navigate the world.
And I'm really starting to see how important it is for all therapists to understand how to bring this theory into all practice.
Yeah, you do. You begin to see that, this is underneath anything we're doing. And I think especially to come back to that point that it's important for therapists to be able to understand their own system. Because in every moment, in every micro moment, our nervous system is having a conversation with our client's nervous system. And for us to understand what is the message we're sending in this moment is incredibly important because we want that communication to be one of welcome. And yet we're human and we move through these states all the time. And there are these micro moments when we move out of welcome into feeling a bit endangered or feeling a bit of that pushback with a client. And their nervous system picks that up immediately through neuroception. So all of this is this implicit experience that's going on. And when we can bring it into explicit awareness and have an explicit conversation about it, everything changes.
So what are the phases of the polyvagal intervention that you developed?
So the first thing is simply to do some psychoed with clients about, here is this amazing thing, this nervous system that really is this essential part of this vehicle you're driving through life, right? We have the brain, and I like to teach my clients about the basic parts of the brain and how they work. But the nervous system is really, for me, where it begins. Because again, 80% of the information from the parasympathetic vagal pathways, 80% is going from the body to the brain. So this is a hugely important experience for clients to understand how this body to brain highway works. So, we begin with either doing some psychoed about the three states, or asking a client to give me an example of an experience recently when they felt distressed. And we then begin to map through that. So some clients like the strict psychoed, and others like to use their own experience to say, oh, so here's where your sympathetic nervous system was activated. Oh, and here's where your dorsal came to the rescue. And so after psychoed, I have a basic mapping series, and the first one is called the personal profile map. And it's that ladder map. And this is the essential first map because it answers the question, where am I? Where am I on my autonomic hierarchy? And so clients will create their personal profile map. We do it together because even though it's their map, it's a dyadic co-regulating process that's happening. And they'll begin to identify for each of their states what happens in their body. What do they think? What do they feel? What do they say? What do they do? And then there are two essential questions they answer for each state. They simply fill in the world is and I am. And those two questions are really powerful examples of what are the core beliefs that each state is bringing into activation for clients. And again, therapists do these maps first for themselves so they get to understand their own system. And then once we have a map, we begin to work with the nervous system, because until my client can begin to have some regulation in their capacity to have at least what I call an anchor in ventral, so that we can safely listen to and explore the stories and the experiences of sympathetic and dorsal, we really can't do therapy. This is about finding enough ventral to be able to be with the stories that are held in the other states rather than be hijacked by them. So we take some time with the mapping. The first map is personal profile. The second map answers the question, how did I get here? And it's what I call the triggers and glimmers map. The triggers are what takes me to sympathetic and dorsal, and the glimmers are what are the things that happen that bring me some ventral. And then the third map is regulating resources, which answers the question, so how do I begin to move towards ventral, and how do I begin to have more ventral in my life? So those three maps are really the foundation of creating this shared language. So we begin to talk this polyvagal language. We begin to look through the nervous system rather than looking through the lens of the cognitive story. And, in fact, when clients come to me in the beginning with a presenting problem, I ask them, would you be willing to put that problem over here on a shelf or on the table next to us just for a little while we get to know how your nervous system is helping you make it through each day? Because I know that even though that presenting problem is what's brought them to therapy, as they begin to understand how to regulate their nervous system, that presenting problem is going to be able to be worked with differently. It's going to look different. When we take it back off the shelf and bring it back into the work, they're going to have a very different experience of it because they're working from a regulated nervous system now. And I also know that as a polyvagal informed therapist, my responsibility, my work, what I want to do with my clients is to really help them understand their own nervous system, because that thing that brought them to therapy is not going to be the only thing they struggle with over the course of their lives. So if I can give them the tools to have a more regulated nervous system, they're going to be able to effectively engage with all those other things that come over the course of a normal life. And then when the more traumatic events come, they're going to know, oh, this is one that I want to take to therapy. And we're already going to have that foundational language about the nervous system and some tools to regulate, both co-regulate and self-regulate, so that we can begin to work on that issue more quickly.
So can you describe how someone would use an autonomic mapping process to track autonomic response patterns? And why is that important?
So the autonomic mapping process is really the foundation of being able to understand what's happening in my nervous system so that I can then see how I'm moving through life differently. For a therapist and clients, this is the place to start. And creating the personal profile map so that I then have helped my client really clearly get to know, I call it befriending. They've befriended their three states and see each state in the ways that it supports them, either in a survival response or in a regulated response as they move through the world. That then leads to this first practice that I call notice and name. And the question then becomes, where are you on your map right now? Name where you are. And then when we can do that, we turn towards. that state and listen for just a moment to what was the cue of danger or safety that just brought that to life? And what is that state trying to tell you in this moment? So that really is this very first steps of becoming attuned to the nervous system. And once a client has done a map, I will stop many times during a session and say, so where are you right now? Right? So because it's not only that I want to know, because I am curious about where they are, but it's that I want my client to develop the capacity to do that on their own easily. So they can just stop anytime and go, where am I now? Because if I'm not in ventral or don't have an anchor in ventral, I'm in a survival response. And a survival response is not going to lead me into connection and problem solving and in a life of feeling some of that well-being we want. So again, it's that question of where am I? And the two guiding questions that I use both in my personal life, but in my professional work, the first is, what does my nervous system need in this moment to either stay in ventral or begin to find its way back to ventral? And when I can answer that and I'm found my anchor in ventral, then I look at the person across from me, whether it's a client or a partner or a friend or a child, and say, what does that nervous system need in this moment to find its way back to ventral so that we can then move through the world together in a way that is nourishing? And we can't answer those questions unless we know where our nervous systems are, because from sympathetic, my nervous system needs to discharge some of this overwhelming energy safely. And from dorsal, my nervous system needs to bring in a bit of energy safely to begin to mobilize again. And then from ventral, my nervous system needs to figure out, how do I savor this place that I've come to find myself in is so nurturing for me.
Sounds like a lot of modeling going on.
Yeah, a polyvagal lens in therapy is really, it's a two-way conversation that's happening all the time. We know that the nervous systems are always in conversation and that implicit work is always there, but we can't do anything until we make it explicit. So my invitation for therapists who work this way is to really be transparent about their own nervous system. I will tell a client when I'm working, did you notice that my sympathetic nervous system just pulled me out for a moment, but now I'm back? And I can only do that if I can track my nervous system in these nuanced ways. And if I then feel the comfort of being able to say that to my client. And the reason to do that is because your client's nervous system through neuroception has picked up on the fact that you left and hopefully picked on the fact that you came back. So if you don't give context to that, then their nervous system is going to simply register something happened, but they don't understand it. And I think that causes incredible problems, and especially for trauma survivors who have been told in their experiences often that what you see or what you feel isn't right. And so I'm simply saying, I just get pulled out for a moment and now I'm back. So I don't need to give my clients the details of what happened. They just need to know that it in fact did happen. And so for me, I need to be tracking. I also need to be able to come back quickly to ventral. And then I need to bring that to my clients and let them know that, yes, this did happen and I'm back. So it gives their nervous system the experience of really what you felt was true. Something did happen. And this person keeps coming back predictably, coming back. And it's that sense of trust through this nervous system place first that begins to get created, because I can tell my client all I want. And our cognitive, our thoughts, our words, our brains can have this conversation. But I like to joke recently and say that if, your brain and your nervous system are in an argument, your brain is going to lose that argument every time. Your nervous system is going to run the show. So I really want to have a nervous system to nervous system conversation rather than a brain to brain conversation. And so in order to do that, I need to know what my nervous system is doing, and I need to share that with my client. And sometimes the sharing is, can you feel that my ventral system is really reaching out to hold you right now? It's another explicit awareness that I want to bring to my client, that my ventral, I am regulated, I am firmly anchored in ventral, and I can hold us here while we do this difficult piece of work. So again, having this different language, this nervous system connection and conversation, I think really supports the therapy in a different way.
What is repatterning, and how can therapists work with their clients to reshape their autonomic nervous system after being affected by trauma?
So I think for therapists, the work in helping clients reshape their nervous system is to first really befriend and get to know what are the patterns that are here, and to see them as adaptive survival responses. The pattern that your system took on was essential in the moment it took it on for whatever reason, and it may not be serving you so well now. Perhaps it's no longer needed in the same way. So as we begin to befriend and understand, then we can begin to use some very simple exercises to begin to reshape. And there are so many ways to reshape the nervous system through movement, through breath, through intention, through language, through story writing. I guess the categories are co-regulation, which is essential. So how does my nervous system co-regulate with my clients? And there are a lot of activities that we do in co-regulation. And then after co-regulation is safely come into life, then it's self-regulation. How do I help my client begin to self-regulate? And I've created a number of practices that we do regularly in the office. The next book has exercises that a therapist would do with their client in the office, and then a client would continue to do between sessions, because what I've really discovered is the nervous system is, of course, interacting all the time with the world. And what we do in the office needs to be supported by inviting our clients to continue to do some autonomic shaping out of the office between sessions. So I think if you understand the organizing principles of where are you in the hierarchy and what is your neuroception bringing you, and co-regulation, which is the third organizing principle, that we are wired to be in connection with other nervous systems. And we need to find that safe connection in enough moments so that we feel the trust in that and the nourishment of that. But if you understand how the nervous system works through these principles, then there are unlimited ways to begin to shape the system in new ways. And I found I've created a number of them, but therapists are creative people. And with a client, you can find lots of ways to reshape. It's that moment of how do we bring more ventral? How do we keep coming back to ventral? And, in this cues of safety, cues of danger, it's really how do we make sure there are more cues of safety than cues of danger in this moment? Because then we can move forward. And I guess the thing I would like to say is that the nervous system takes in both. So we need to both be actively working to reduce or resolve the cues of danger, but we also have to help clients actively experience cues of safety. And those cues of safety are often with a pet, in nature, in the therapy office, with another person. These are all the ways the nervous system, again, wants to be safely anchored in the world. And as we begin to have more ways of being safely anchored in the world, even in micro moments, that's all we need, micro moments, the system begins to reshape. Because again, it's a system of shaping through experience, through the environment, through relationships. So as we begin to have more ventral vagal inspired connections, the system begins to shape itself more towards connection.
Can you share a poignant example where polyvagal theory in therapy had a major impact in someone's life without sharing any identifying information, of course?
I'll share more of a general experience that I've had, because I now get emails frequently from people around the world who have read the book and have done their first map. And that experience of doing the first map is often this light bulb moment for both therapists and clients that, oh my goodness, I understand myself in a new way. And when you see yourself through the nervous system, you let go of shame and self-criticism and blame. And that's the comment that I get so often from people I don't even know, who just say, oh, I can see this is my biology. This is not my intention or my making a bad choice or my being a bad person. That's the one I get most often. I'm not a bad person. I have a nervous system that's been shaped this way. And now I know why I responded in this way to that traumatic event. And that to me is the beginning of the path towards healing. I understand I am not bad for having this response. And now we can begin to work with shaping the system.
My next question is, who is polyvagal theory in therapy not appropriate for? I'm starting to think it's appropriate, like you mentioned before, for everyone in therapy. But can you say if there's anyone that you would not recommend this theory for?
I really don't have someone that I would not recommend this for, because for me, this is a basic biological system that we all have, and it's shaped in one way or another. So simply understanding that, here's how your body works, I think is important for everybody. Now, there's certainly people who are in a crisis or in a psychotic event are highly dissociated in the moment, and you can't do this then. But I don't think that means you can't ever do it. And I think it makes it really helpful information for everybody to look at. I was recently talking with someone who works in palliative care. And yes, it has a place there too, both for the family to help them understand their autonomic responses. And so can they show up with a ventral vagal welcome or ventral vagal love for their family member who's dying? And for the family member who's dying, to help them understand, here's what's happening in your nervous system. So even in those moments, understanding the biology of response brings compassion.
So Deb, what are you most excited about in mental health treatment today?
Oh, well, for me, because I'm a passionate polyvagalist is what I like to say. As I get out and I spend most of my time now teaching and doing consultation and helping therapists begin to look at the world this way, I have been so excited by the response that clinicians of all kinds have given back, saying they're beginning to integrate this into schools, into medical settings, into the legal setting, into business, into organizations, agencies, and private practice. And to think that, wow, this is the ripple effect. It's getting out there into the world. And I like to think we're going to change the world one nervous system at a time. And for me, as I see all of these nervous systems beginning to understand, it feels exciting to think that agencies are taking this on and thinking, how can we look at how we offer services to our clients in a way that respects their nervous system response and doesn't label them as good clients or bad clients or needy clients or non-compliant, but simply looking at what can we do to offer enough cues of safety so that the client can be successful in whatever they're coming here to seek support with. So for me, if we could look at therapy as first and foremost creating enough autonomic safety so that then clients could engage in whatever the model of therapy, whatever they want to work on, that would be amazing for me.
And I'd like to add that I'm very excited about how you were able to take Dr. Stephen Porges' work and really make it accessible for therapists, because I studied him a little bit, but I really feel like the more I listen, the more I understand. So I'm grateful for you and for Dr. Stephen Porges for bringing this to us.
Yeah. Steve is a brilliant research scientist, and none of this would exist without his amazing, groundbreaking work in creating this new map, this updated map of the autonomic nervous system. And then I've been blessed to be able to translate his brilliant work into what feels like is easily applicable to my colleagues in working with clients. And it's a great joy to do this and to be able to collaborate with Steve. So yeah, thanks.
So if you had a magic wand and could improve one thing about mental health treatment today, what would that be?
Oh, my magic wand. I'm going to wave that magic wand, and every single person in the entire world is going to be taught about their nervous system in school. Starting in school, they're going to learn, and medical schools are going to teach it, and judges are going to understand it. And so my magic wand is this. It's going to spread the polyvagal lens all across the world.
I agree. So how can my audience learn more about your work, either online or in print?
So online, my website is rhythmofregulation.com, and it lists all my workshops. It's got some downloadable resources. It has podcasts and webinars I've done. It also will have links to my books. The first book, Polyvagal Theory and Therapy, is, I think, a really great place to start. I would invite people to buy that book and start there, and then maybe create a small practice group and do it with colleagues. Do the exercises for yourself first, and then try them out with clients. The second book, Polyvagal Exercises for Safety and Connection, is coming out spring 2020. And that's the one that's going to have exercises that you would introduce with your clients in a session, and they would then use practice between sessions with the goal of creating a group of practices that are going to help them over the course of their life continue to shape their system and then maintain that new shape. So I think the other thing I want to mention I'm really excited about is I'm creating a polyvagal flip chart, which will be a great tool for clinicians to have in their office so that they can just flip the pages and show their clients, oh, here's what we're talking about. Here's what we're working with today. And we'll have some of the maps in reusable form in that flip chart. And then because polyvagal is more than a clinical tool, I've just recorded an audio program, which will be available for the general public, because I think it's important for everyday people, not just therapists, clinicians, to understand this theory. So all of that you can find on the website. And I hope that I'll get to meet some of your listeners at a workshop someday.
And all of those resources will also be on therapyshow.com. I'm creating a page dedicated to your work. So Deb, on behalf of myself, my listeners, and all of the people that you've helped through your work, I want to thank you for your contributions to mental health treatment and for taking the time out of your busy schedule to help me and my audience better understand the field of polyvagal theory and therapy.
Thank you, Bridget. It's really a delight to talk with you. And I hope you and I get to meet in person one day.
I would be very honored. So be sure to check out my website, therapyshow.com. Again, I will have a page dedicated to polyvagal theory and therapy, and it has many other resources about mental health. And there you will also find how to submit questions, stories, or insights that you have about the mental health system, or suggestions about who else I can interview and how I can improve the show. So I'd like to close by reminding our listeners to please subscribe, share, and review this podcast so you, someone you love, and people around the world can gain more benefit from therapy. There's no need to suffer in silence. Get the help that you need to create the life that you want.